to the Stop Booking Around podcast. I'm Jon Cronshaw.
And I'm Russ Evans.
Last week I gave Russ the challenge to basically start writing. We looked at your antagonist, your protagonist. My thought was, let's put these characters together and see what we come up with. The thing that I chose for you to do was to have them trapped in a lift together. You know, it's the way they talk to each other and respond is what I was looking for. It's not a thing that's going to be in your novel, but it's just a nice little scene to get you used to writing something, finishing something, and to have your characters' voices and the way they react to each other coming through. How did you find the exercise?
It was kind of difficult at first, to be honest with you, because the story isn't set in any kind of particular modern setting or even real-world setting. So when you said elevator, I was like, well, how do I write these characters into this setting for just purely their sort of responses? And I honestly found that difficult. So I instead still kept the same scenario, but I set it in the fiction. I was writing it and I was like, oh yeah, this could actually be like in the story. I don't know if it will, but it's a kind of like a little moment, a sort of a crystallization of how the two characters look at things and the main problem that the protagonist has to face, which is obviously her effect on her surroundings because of her sort of inherent nihilism.
Yeah, so I think one of the key themes that's coming out here is the idea of trust. I mean, is that, I take it that's a kind of big thing within your story.
For the main character, it is, because her sort of life previous to this, she didn't find a lot of trust. She wasn't greatly betrayed by people, but she never felt like anybody really gave her a reason to trust them.
The writing is fine. I think, you know, you've got a lot to work with here. I'm just looking through it now, and one thing that has struck me is you're a new writer, so the idea of head hopping might not be a thing you're aware of. And I know basically Frank Herbert does this, and he's about the only person who can do it well. So, like, you know, in you, it seems from the start you're from is it Inigo's perspective, because you're talking about what he knows, and then later on you're from Theodora's perspective, and it's like basically you need to pick a side. You need to have it from one character's perspective. Now, you can do what someone like Terry Pratchett does, which is you'll have a scene and you'll come to a scene break and then you'll switch perspective. But if you notice what Terry Pratchett does, he'll always stick in every scene with one character's perspective, their thoughts, and you don't hear what the other person's thinking. Okay. Now, you might do in the next scene, you might do it after a scene break, but it will muddy, it will make it confusing for the reader if all of a sudden because you're like, oh, I thought this was about him. Or, you know, it's like establishing who your point of view character is and making it a strong voice. That's going to help your story more than kind of hopping around. Keep it simple. I've mentioned this elsewhere. You read one of my early attempts a few years ago now called The Slip, which when I was writing it, you know, it had like 13 point of view characters, and it was a bit of a mess because it lacked the focus and lacked that kind of central thing. And I had all these different stories and different ideas that I wanted to throw at it. And I ended up having a realization moment where I said to myself, right, I need to write a story that's got one point of view character that's told in a linear way. I didn't have the skills to write what I envisaged for The Slip. I wanted to write a Game of Domes, basically Game of Thrones in space. Just, you know, and had all these big ideas, and I couldn't handle it because I wasn't that good, and I'm still not that good. It might be a story I'll come back to in a few years, but at the minute, I'm now just kind of venturing into flipping between two different major settings. You know, I'm still at an early phase, even though, you know, I'm about to embark on my fifth novel. And I think the more I get through and complete projects, the more I can kind of start experimenting and start expanding what I'm doing.
I think for me, when I was writing this, it was partly the brief you gave me, but it was also partly, I think it's the want for readers to understand your characters. You know, you don't always have to see the internal workings of a character to understand them. You know, it's their actions really that can really define them. And also if you're trying to, I suppose, like I'm trying to do, where I'm sort of writing a character that's going to take a major, an antagonist who, you know, is going to take a major heel turn at some point. It's better not to maybe signpost how they think and feel too much, so that when it does happen, you've got more of a chance to talk about it instead of it just be like, oh yes, I saw that all along.
What you want really is there's a great term that's used in film, and it's surprising but inevitable. It's like you don't want it to be. What's his name? The guy who did the Sixth Sense and films like that. You know,
M. Night Shyamalan.
Yeah. So like I find his way of doing the twist, the surprise, like really heavy-handed and really clumsy. It's not story to me. That's just like, oh look, it's a thing, and then when you go back to it, it might reward a second watch, but then there's nothing else to it beyond the twist.
Everything he seems to do does seem to like be about leading up to the twist.
Like the heel turn again, it's kind of a bit of a clumsy way of doing things, like the shock. Oh no, he's really the bad guy, kind of pulling off the mask or whatever. You need it to be an inevitable thing. So it needs to be, if he carries on in this direction, and it could happen like this, or it could, like, it's got different branches that it could go on.
Yes.
And there's got to be a point of no return where, maybe the character has a realization that, oh dear, they're going down this bad path. It's like people tolerated the Nazis in Germany, and okay, if you follow this through with what we know now, then we know that it does inevitably lead to the Holocaust.
Yeah.
But people didn't know that and wouldn't have been able to see that in the early 30s. It's the same way you need to think about your antagonist, is the seeds have got to be there, and it could be a thing as well where, okay, a careful reader will see them maybe a quarter of the way through. It's obvious, there's no doubt at 3/4 of the way through, something like that, where you need it there, you need it to build up, and for it not to be just a sudden flip of a switch, because then you're just going to have an unrealistic character. You need this kind of depth and progression. Progression's really important.
Having Iago's arc as a character planned out, not in detail, obviously, because there's going to be certain events along the way that he will use or take advantage of to further his agenda, which is going to be ending the underworld, because he still continues to exist when he doesn't want to.
Have you watched Breaking Bad?
I have indeed watched Breaking Bad. Okay. He's not quite a Walter White. He's not.
But the kind of, what I was saying about the surprising yet inevitable, his rise from being a school teacher who needs some money and makes a bit of cash on the side to being, basically a drug overlord, and each little thing of shedding his moral fibre, making compromising, making sacrifices or something against his own person. If you can get even close to that level of storytelling, you're going to do something good. So,
well, let's take Walter White as a character. Like, he does what he does, obviously, out of desperation. It also becomes like an ego thing as a character, because he's been quite trod on. But then there's also the question of, like, well, did he allow himself to be trodden on? And, a lot of these decisions actually his, and he's just bitter. Whereas with Inigo, he's had literally hundreds of years for this feeling to fester. And it's not until he meets Theodora and witnesses what she's capable of, and then realizes that maybe there's an opportunity here for him to change things. And using Theodora, he gains political power, and eventually sort of takes the highest position of power in the underworld. And from there, he uses that power to enact his plan. And as much as I do love just a straight up like evil villain, good people that end up doing terrible things are better villains.
They're more interesting, aren't they? Because it's all of us, and we've all got that potential. We've all got that darkness within us. That's what stories are for. They're lessons. And, it's like you can choose this way or you can choose that way. And this is what happens when you choose this way.
Yeah.
I mean, with these exercises then, do you feel now that you've almost got closer to your characters because, you've almost put some flesh on the bones and you've got them to talk, and, you've actually done something with them rather than them just kind of floating around in a nebulous form in your head?
Yeah, but I definitely sort of wrote out some dialogue, and I was like, no, that's just, it just feels like a conversation. It just feels generic. And then I thought more about dialect, Inigo he's being Spanish, being from like the time of about halfway through the Inquisitions. And then sort of thinking about that, and then adding X amount of 100 years of him being around the culture of the underworld, his language and his choice of words, there's not much abbreviation, order in which he uses words. I had to stand there in my head and sort of think about like Latin or Spanish characters I've read or watched, and think about how they speak, the order in which they put words. Then in comparison to that, you've got Theodora, who is from the modern era, who does abbreviate her words, who says yeah instead of yes, and things like that. So when I gave them their sort of voices and they started to speak properly with the right words and the right dialects, the interplay between them became sort of more obvious. And it's, it's something you've seen time and time again. You've got the formal master and the informal student. I've literally I was just thinking it's that sort of in Kill Bill 2 when you've got Beatrix and Pai Mei, and they're another sort of example of this situation, slightly more abusive, but in the so far that she's sort of like a modern woman and he's like this almost ancient Chinese guy who, according to the stories that Bill tells, could be, X amount of 100 years old. He's just kept alive by kung fu magic. I like when two characters contrast, they end up, I feel like, learning from each other or picking up things from each other, which tends to make them more endearing as a pair. And then so obviously when something comes between them, or one decides to sort of move in a direction that the other doesn't, I think there is more of a conflict.
I mean, it's good that you're thinking along the lines of, okay, this is his background, this is her background, it's going to affect the speech. And really, you can get rid of all the dialogue tags, you can get rid of all the actions. And when you know you've got a strong character voice, you can just literally put lines of the character and go, all right, that's him, that's her, that's him, that's her. And you should be able to identify them without having any of the other signifiers. So I think that's really effective what you've done with that. So for next week, I think we need to think about who this book is for. I do apologise that we're not diving right in yet to writing your epic, but I think I hope what you're seeing is, what I'm doing now is I'm kind of giving you the groundwork just to give you a firm basis for your story. And I think other authors can benefit from doing this kind of thing as well, where you've thought about your elevator pitch, you've thought about your story core, you've thought about who your main characters are, what their motivations are, what they sound like, and you've not written a word towards your story yet. You haven't outlined yet. You haven't done anything like that. But it's all slowly starting to solidify what you need to do. So next time, I want you to think about your audience, and I want you to do this in a way almost like you did with your character profiles. I want you to make a character profile almost of who is your ideal reader. And I think once you've got that, it will help you on a deeper level think about who you're writing for, because you need to get out of this mindset of I'm writing this book for myself, because when you do that, you will drift into self-indulgence and you'll probably end up writing something that's a bit crap. So when you start thinking, right, I'm writing something that is going to touch someone, that is going to entertain someone, who is that person? Think you can do that for next week?
I think I can.
Awesome. Remember, you can follow me on Twitter. It's at JL Cronshaw. If you want to email the show, it's john@joncronshaw.com. That's JONCRONSHAW. We now have a Facebook group. Just search for Stop Booking Around. We'll have some writing stuff and have some banter on there. Maybe ask Russell questions, give him advice, that kind of thing. So until next time, cheerio.
Bye.